I'm here with Dr. Yamini Atmavilas from India. She's the chair of Gender Studies at the Center for Human Development at the Administrative Staff College of India. Welcome at the German Development Institute.
Thank you for having me.
Yamini, what do you see as the major contribution of the program Managing Global Governance, which is implemented jointly by the German Development Institute and GIZ?
I think I can speak to it from a couple of different perspectives. One, I've come back now as an instructor, but I also went through the course last year. And to me, one of the biggest takeaways is the other people I met and the conversations that I had. So if I were to put that in perspective, I would probably say that one of the strengths of the program is just facilitating dialogue, and dialogue that's not just north-south or north transferring knowledge to people from the south, but really truly facilitating a discussion among different southern representatives who come from a variety of backgrounds. Some are from government, some are from the NGO sector, some are researchers, and some are from think tanks, and really sort of bringing this multidisciplinary perspective to the whole question of global governance and what we mean by it. And it's one of these terms that has as many definitions as the number of people who try to define it. And so I think one of the biggest, the greatest experiences for me of being a participant was to really learn to kind of understand some of these different perspectives and not just look at it through my own lens, which also was a big way of building relationships and bridges to other people from my own country who I wouldn't have had this conversation with otherwise. And I think in terms of the impact, it's going to be much more long-term than short-term. I mean, in the short term, sure, you've got networks and you have friendships and you think of ways to work collaboratively and you think of ways to talk about these issues, or you've got people that you can have as sounding boards. But really, in terms of a longer-term impact, I think it sows the seeds for us to always use this as a frame of reference when we do our own work, and to bring this perspective when we are at fora where we can have conversations about governance, but also about development and the G20 and some of these different phenomena that are quite salient right now.
Your research topic is the role of gender in global governance. Why is it so important to focus on gender aspects within global governance regimes?
This is something that's been something that I've been preoccupied with recently, and what I've been struck by is when we talk about global governance, we're talking about extremely macro issues, or we talk about it in terms of macro trends and looking at financial crises and inflation and the trade between countries. But really, when you start looking at impacts, it's something that impacts all of us as individuals and as parents, as migrants, as workers, as people just trying to make a living and get by and live the best life that we want to live. And so when you start putting a human face on some of these phenomena that seem so abstract almost, then you start looking at questions of inequality and who seems to benefit more from it and why there are certain types of impacts that we see. And so to me, talking about gender as far as global governance goes is to really bring that lens when you look at gender inequalities and gender disparities and look at the relative positions of men and women, individuals, as well as entities within a global system. What are the types of values that some of these phenomena hold? What are the values that those who design certain types of trade policies, for instance, hold, and what are the assumptions that they have about how people are going to experience them? And so to me, as someone who looks at these questions from a very micro perspective, it's bringing in 2 or 3 fundamental ideas, or to put it together and to develop a kind of a lens on global governance. One of them is that you start with the understanding or the assumption that men and women experience these phenomena differently. And so then you start looking for what are the differences and why those differences happen, what constructs them. Is it rooted in culture? Is it rooted in the local economy? Is it a national phenomena? Is it because of certain policies? Or is it because they're also at the macro level, certain policies that have assumptions about who is a worker and who should benefit. On the other hand, a second added to that is when we talk about women, we're talking about the productive as well as the reproductive domain, which is the household domain. So to me, looking at global governance from a gender perspective is also bringing this other side, the household and what happens within the reproductive domain, into the same conversation as GDP and inflation and economic crises. And so bringing all of these and trying to look at how these correlate with each other. What are the impacts of subsidies being cut, for instance, on women's time use is one of the biggest questions that we've been discussing in the gender literature. And so really bringing in these different and seemingly disparate concepts into the same spectrum and saying, if we put a gender lens on this, what are the types of answers that we get and what kinds of insights would we have?
What could be the role of India in this respect, and should it take a lead amongst the emerging powers in this regard?
Well, if we're talking about a new type of global governance, then I would imagine we're talking about questions of multipolarity and different types of a different frame of reference for how we understand power and responsibility and change and the types of... So to me, rather than leadership, I think every country has a certain type of historical trajectory of what it brings to the international domain. And so I think this is something that everyone should be really talking about in terms of, gendering global governance. And as far as what specifically India could bring to the table, we've got an excellent tradition of research on gender and impacts of structural adjustment processes, of looking at macro phenomena, but also we've got excellent research on time use. So really, to me, the role of an Indian government representation, for instance, within some of these fora, would be to really bring some of this research and some of these questions to the same domain and to sort of raise the possibility of a discussion around it, rather than foreclosed kind of conclusions. So to me, that would be the role that India can strongly play.
Yamini, thank you so much for joining us today here at the German Development Institute in Bonn.